Sea Life students, welcome to our first ever Press Pause ministry. That's right, first ever Press Pause ministry. So whether you're in Forney, you're in Kaufman, you're in Sunnyvale, you're in Rockwall, wherever you're watching this, I want to welcome you. And you may be wondering, what in the world is a Press Pause message? Well, we at Sea Life, we normally do this on Sundays, but we decided, we got together, we wanted to do this as a student ministry of you hear a message from Pastor Jeremy. If you're in Forney, you hear a message from Pastor Tyler. If you're in Sunnyvale, every Wednesday, and my guess is it's fire. I've heard both of them speak, and it's awesome. And I know if you're in Kaufman, you usually hear me. And they're usually the same message, but there's some slight differences with our own spin on it. And tonight, we just figured that we wanted to do this about once a quarter, that we wanted to get together as a family, 3 different locations, 4 if you count Rockwall, and we wanted to press pause. We wanted the same night, same message, same person. And you may be wondering, why in the world, Jeff, are you speaking and not Pastor Jeremy or Pastor Tyler? That's a great question, and it's a really simple answer. We got together as a student ministry, and we wanted to do from bottom to top best-looking youth pastors, and it was close between Jeremy and I, but since he's married, he got the second one, and then Tyler, he obviously is in a league of his own. And so here I am, the third best looking youth pastor, getting the privilege to deliver the first Press Pause message. And I think before I move on, I want to celebrate, just take a moment and celebrate all of what God has done over the past. I mean, I've been in Sea Life, I've been on staff with Sea Life a little over a year now, and I've gotten to see a lot of people come and go, and a lot of different things within the student ministry, and God has been doing so many things. I know at Forney, it is a normal thing under the tutelage. I don't know why I just used tutelage. That's a great word, under Pastor Jeremy, and it's a normal thing for on Wednesday night to have over 200 students, 250 students, which is incredible. The growth that they've experienced there, and they baptized, I think, 10 people this last the celebration Wednesday when you guys were baptizing. And I think I heard a story about a student middle of the service who just jumped in the water in his jeans. He's like, I can't take it anymore. I'm going public. And I love that. We baptized somebody in Kaufman in the pajamas, and then their pajamas, so I get that. But there's a lot of great things happening in Forney. I know in Sunnyvale, under Pastor Tyler's tutelage, there's a lot of great things happening in it. And I remember even before Tyler was at Sunnyvale, when Jeremy and I were praying for who God would send, God, send your man. We want somebody that's going to be a bro, but then is also the person that you want here. And I remember it was a normal thing for there to be 50, 60 students at Sunnyvale. And now to see what the Lord has done through Tyler's faithfulness and the leaders there, that now I think they've reached 130 at one point on a Wednesday night, and it's a normal thing for them to be between 100 and 120. I mean, that doesn't make any sense, but God's in it, and I'm thankful for both of them. And Pastor Tyler, real quick, I don't want to forget my Kaufman people. Before, when I first walked into the building at Kaufman, I remember Randy Wade and Blake walked me in, and I remember going in the sanctuary and just getting this vision from God of just students packed in the place where there was hardly any room, and leaders just committed, sold out for Jesus. And there have been nights, you guys remember the Foam Coming, Quiet Riot, where God, and just different Wednesdays and events where God has done so many special things at Kaufman. And there's the energy, the excitement, the growth that students growing in their walk with the Lord, and people. I don't know if there is a Wednesday where I don't get a text message from Tyler or Jeremy, or I don't send a text message to them post-service where at least a couple students have come to know Christ for the first time. And so God's doing some incredible things. And also, I've mentioned Pastor Tyler and Pastor Jeremy. I want to take 30 seconds to talk about Pastor Tyler. I'm thankful for his friendship. I'm thankful I'm a better follower of Jesus and man because of him. And I know that for Jeremy and I, at least before Tyler came in, we were like, man, we're bros and we're bringing somebody else on. I don't know how this whole thing's going to work, but God brought Tyler at just the right time, and he has blessed me. I know he's been a blessing over at Sunnyvale, and God has used him in incredible ways. And you just get around, you get around Tyler, and his words, his actions, everything is centered around God, and I'm a better person because of him. And then, of course, Pastor Jeremy, one of my very best friends. I love you, and everything I really know about student ministry and a lot of the growth I've experienced as a pastor is due to your being under your tutelage. And so thank you, Pastor Jeremy, for everything you do. And when I think of Jeremy, I think of in our student ministry, as soon as he came on the scene, I mean, our student ministry exploded, and the culture he's created, I love to be a part of every single day. And one of the things I think of when I think of Jeremy is, Jesus said that the greatest among you will be your servant. And that is exactly what, when I think about Jeremy, I think about somebody who serves, who comes up under people and lifts them up and supports them. And so if you are at the Forney campus or if you are at the Sunnyvale campus, you need to go find Pastor Tyler, Pastor Jeremy, give them a round of applause, go hug them. And they deserve to be honored for all of the things that they do for our student ministry and for me. But before we move on to the message, I've been saying this a little bit in Kaufman, and it's kind of been catching on. But one of the things that I say a lot of the time is you need to let your hair down. And what do I even mean by you need to let your hair down? Well, some of you came in tonight with your hair up. And you are distracted, you are feeling heavy, you are thinking about anything and everything but ready to receive from God. And you just need to let your hair down, relax, be ready to receive from Him the word that He has for you tonight. And I believe, just as I was been praying about this message and thinking, every single person, whether you realize it or not, needs to hear this message tonight. And so if you're at the if you're at the Forney campus, Sunnyvale campus, Rockwall, Kaufman, wherever you're watching this, I just want you to do me a favor and just kind of shake your head like this and say, I'm letting my hair down. I'm ready to receive from the Lord what He has for me tonight. And you may be wondering, where are we going with this message, Jeff? What direction are we going? This is exactly where we're going. I want to give you a crystal clear picture of what Jesus is like when we fail Him. What Jesus is like when we fail Him. What does He think about us? What does He say about us? What is the things how does He view us? What does He want us to do? What does He want us to say? That's where we're going tonight. And I believe that it's also important that we see not only what Jesus is like in that, but how we are to respond to Him in failure. Because we all have failed Him. And as I was preparing this message, I was thinking about some different ways that I have blown it in a big way. And my mind immediately, I went to a few things, but my mind immediately went to the first day of middle school. And I don't know, you go back, some of you remember it like it was yesterday, because, it was like earlier this year or last year, but the first day of middle school, for my 7th graders in the room, you get it, but it is the transition from elementary school to middle school is a big jump. Everyone's trying to act like it's cool, everything's good, but inside everyone's terrified. Actually, that's kind of life in general. Everyone is trying to play it cool like they've got it figured out, but on the inside, everyone's terrified. And I remember thinking, I've had a good run in elementary school. I know some people, that are going to my middle school. I feel good about my teachers in elementary school, and I feel good about the teachers that I know that work at the middle school. And actually, one of the things I was most terrified about, and this is going to seem really random, but I was most terrified about getting in my locker, unlocking my lock, and getting in my locker. And I don't know what drove that, but for some reason I was afraid that I wouldn't be able to put my books in my locker. And I remember going to open house or orientation or whatever they call it, where you can go and meet your teachers, walk around a couple days or a day before the first day of school. And I remember that was the one problem I had, where we went up to my locker, we practiced, and I kind of tried to play it cool, like, yeah, I got it, and I couldn't get it, and my mom, like, you sure you got it? I'm like, I got it, and you know what, I'm a gamer, I'll figure it out the first day, we're going to be fine. But inside, I'm just terrified that I'm not going to be able to get in my locker. And this was a problem because, believe me, I had thought through all scenarios of, man, maybe I don't even need my locker. I'll just carry around my books everywhere I go and I won't have to use it. But my first hour teacher said, hey, you only can bring the stuff that you need for this class and nothing else. So don't be cluttering up my aisle with your backpack, all right? Some of you guys know teachers like that. And really particular, and so, man, I'm going to have to figure out this locker situation. And so I remember my mom dropping me off in a minivan that had it was a white minivan with blood red interior, and most people would be self-conscious about that. I could care less about that, honestly. I just remember thinking on the way to school, man, I just got to get in my locker, and I was running through the combination in my head. I had the combination written on my hand. I was like, can't forget this. Okay, if I can just do this, then the rest of the day is going to be fine. And I remember my twin brother and I walking up to class, and I told him about it. He's like, you're going to be fine, Jeff. It'll be good. And I walk up to my locker, and it was just like this music. I could hear this music playing in the background of like this ominous music. And I get to the locker, and I can see my first hour class right down the hallway. And I start doing it, and the 5-minute bell rings. I'm like, I got 5 minutes, we're good. And I'm like just trying to pull it off, and it's not working. And I'm looking at other people, and it just looks like they're not even doing the combination and pulling it off. Like, how is this so easy for everyone else? And it's just this difficult for me. And I remember the 1-minute bell rang, and I'm feeling like anxious. And at this point, I'm panicking over being tardy. And I found out later, wasn't that big of a deal because there's some grace there. But for some reason, I felt like I was going to get called out in class. And I couldn't be tardy, and so I'm looking at the door, I'm looking at my locker, and I just decide, you know what? I take off my backpack, I set it in front of my locker, I grab the stuff that I need for my class, and then I go to my first hour. Surely nobody's going to take a 7th grader's backpack just full of books and pens and pencils. And I remember finishing first hour, and I came around the corner, and sure enough, backpack's not there. I'm like, you know what? Maybe somebody took it to the lost and found, a police officer, a teacher, or whatever. Not there. And then I find out that, the backpack's nowhere to be found. Who steals a 7th grader's backpack? I have no idea. But I remember just feeling this weight of disappointment and discouragement, and I'm the biggest failure in the world. If the first day of middle school is like this, how is the rest of middle school going to go? How's the rest of high school, college? And the hamster wheel's just spinning. And I remember thinking, you know what? I'm just going to call it a day. We're calling it a day. I'm calling my mom. Of course, you don't call dad, because my dad would have told me, tough, life's tough, rub some dirt on it, you'll be fine. But I knew at least my mom would hear me out. And so I called my mom, and sure enough, she's like, okay, yeah, fine, I'll be there in a little bit. And I remember thinking, man, I wonder if even my mom feels like I'm a failure. And she rolled up to the school, and I remember she came out, and she gave me a big hug, and she cracked a few jokes. And we got in the car, and she's like, hey, do you want to go get an icy? And I'm like, man, this is awesome. I know that. And we go to 7-Eleven, and we get a cherry Dr. Pepper icy, and we get in the car. And I remember my mom, she said, now, Jeff, we can't do this every day. And I'm like, yes, I know we can't do this every day. I get that. She's like, you're going to have to push through days where some things are going to happen, and you're just going to have to push through it and be tough. But I want you to know it's going to be okay. And I remember thinking to myself, you know what? It was just like this conversation changed the whole trajectory of my life. I feel like that. I remember looking around, and I was like, I got an awesome mom. I got an awesome family. I'm drinking an icy. I'm out of school early. You know what? We're just going to take a few deep breaths, take a step back, and we're just going to attack it tomorrow, and it's going to be fine. It is going to be okay. And then sure enough, I figured out the lock thing. But why do I tell you that story? Is I feel like that we are going to see as we jump into this passage in John chapter 21 about Peter, we're going to see maybe some parallels of how my mom treated me with kindness, with humor, with grace. We addressed the issue, and then she just with love. And we're going to see some parallels between how my mom treated me and where we see Jesus is treating, what Jesus is treating Peter like. in this passage. And before we jump into John 21, we have to go through just a little bit of background. You remember Peter's well-known disciple. He's bold. He's well-known in Acts for all of the people he communicated the gospel to, and we know thousands of people came to faith in Christ because of Peter. And out of all the things that we respect about Peter, there is one thing that we know about Peter, is that he denied Jesus. And denied Jesus 3 times. And for most of Peter's ministry, we know that Jesus was a popular guy for the most part with the crowds, is that he was performing miracles, and he was speaking as one who had authority, and he was saying these things that people weren't used to hearing, and he was treating people with the poor with respect and the sick, and he was doing all of these things, and for the most part, the crowd widely accepted Jesus, minus the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And so there comes a point where Peter says, the night that Jesus was to be betrayed by Judas and taken away, he says, even if all of these people fall away, I will not fall away. And even I will follow you unto death. And Jesus says, will you, Peter? No, you're not. Actually, this very night you will deny me 3 times. And I can imagine hearing that and being like, wait, did he hear what I said? Like in the commitment I said it with, and in the no, but what happens? That Jesus gets taken away. And then as he's taken away, Peter's following at a distance, and he follows at a distance, and he is experiencing something maybe that he didn't experience during Jesus' ministry. It's an absolute rejection of Jesus. This crowd, this mob has developed, and they're out for one thing. They want to crucify Jesus. They want to find some way to trap him, and of course he's getting mocked and spit on. One of the darkest moments in Jesus' life. And Peter, he's standing around this fire, and somebody says, hey, you're one of his followers, right? And he says, no, and then it happens again. He says, no, and then it happens again. He says, no, and then actually he even begins to curse like a sailor because he wants people to know that he doesn't know Jesus. And it says in that moment that the rooster crowed, and then in one of the gospel accounts it says that he looks at Peter, that you imagine this man, Jesus, one of his best friends, he's looking at one of his darkest moments, and that feeling that would have washed over Peter of guilt and shame and this betrayal. He's betrayed. He's failed Jesus tremendously, and is one of his greatest moments of need. And it says that Peter went out and wept bitterly. And so it's with that backdrop that we know that Jesus actually went to the cross. He died, rose 3 days later, and we just celebrated that on Easter. You can get excited about that. But the tomb is empty, and we know that before this scene in John chapter 21, that Jesus actually appeared to the disciples twice, and both in locked rooms, which is awesome. He's like, peace be with you, and everyone's freaked out. And he's like, is that salmon? Can I get in on that? And he eats some fish, but he never addresses the issue with Peter in those 2 accounts. So you've got to be thinking Peter is feeling, is this ever going to get talked about? What does Jesus think of me? Is this do I just need to go back to fishing? And he's all of these. And so it's with that backdrop, we jump into John chapter 21, verse 1. And it says, after this, Jesus revealed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, which is the Sea of Galilee. And he revealed himself in this way: Simon Peter, Thomas, called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, which we know are James and John, and 2 of the others of his disciples were together. And Simon Peter said to him, I am going fishing. And they said to them, we will go with you, because they're good friends, and who's going to let their buddy fish alone? And so we'll go with you. And they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. I see this statement from Peter, and I actually think about Michael Jordan when he was playing basketball for a while. He's the GOAT, and he won some championships with the Bulls, and a really random thing, he decided to play professional baseball for a while, and then he came from professional baseball, came back and held a press conference, and he said, I'm playing basketball. And nobody was like, well, what do you mean, Michael? Are you going to go play basketball with your kids in the driveway? Or you going to go to LA Fitness and play some pickup games? Like, what do you mean? No. Everyone knew this was a career move. He was moving from baseball, coming back to basketball. And I get this sense from Peter that there is he has failed Jesus. There's this guilt. There's this shame that has washed. And he's like, you know what? Before Jesus ever called Peter, he was a generational fisherman. He was a fisherman. And Jesus was calling him out of just being a fisherman to being a fisher of men. But oftentimes, when we feel like we failed God, what do? We distract ourselves with busyness. We go to the to-do list. We do anything and everything to keep us from really dealing with the issue and coming to God. We run from him. And Peter, he's like, you know what? I'm going fishing. And his buddies, the disciples, they come with him. And I love what it says here in verse 3. It says, they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. And just as day was breaking, and just a quick note there that it says that, hey, they caught nothing. Well, how is that way of life going for you? How is that busyness going for you? And you want to know one of the ways in which God is after you is that he will frustrate things. He will complicate things. And it's no coincidence to me that the disciples didn't catch anything that night. And you got to think Peter is like, man, I failed Jesus. I'm going back to fishing. That's what I'm going to do. And okay, I'm not catching anything here. And just like, man, I'm blowing it everywhere, right? And then Jesus comes on the scene in verse 4. It says, just as day was breaking, Jesus stood on the shore, and yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Now we know later on in this passage that he was about 100 yards away, so a football field away, and they don't recognize that it's Jesus. And Jesus said to them, children, do you have any fish? And they answered him, no. And he said to them, cast the net on the right side of the boat and you will find some. And so they cast it. And now they were not able to haul it in because of the quantity of fish. I love this. If you do not know Jesus of Nazareth, if you do not know him, one of the things that he is he has the best sense of humor. And he calls out to them. He says, children, have you caught anything? And of course they don't recognize it's Jesus at first. And do you think he knows the answer to that question? Of course he knows the answer to that question. It makes me think of when Mary, the tomb was empty, and he comes up to Mary and she's weeping because they think that they've taken the body somewhere else, and she thinks he's the gardener, and he comes up to her and he says, woman, why are you weeping? Well, whom are you seeking? Of course, Jesus knows the answer to that question, and she's, thinks he's the gardener, and then, you can just sense that he just smiles and says, Mary. And it's me. And not only that, but on the road to Emmaus, he shows up and these two guys are talking about Jesus and Jerusalem and the things happening in Jerusalem during that time. And Jesus walks up and he's like, hey, what are you guys talking about? And of course he knows what they're talking about, and they don't recognize him. And then he proceeds to talk, or they proceed to tell him about his own death, burial, and potential resurrection that they've heard about. And they still don't recognize him. Then Jesus is like, well, I think this Jesus guy was actually the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. And he begins to walk with them and tell them everything concerning himself. And like, man, this guy's making a whole lot of sense. And then they get to the place where they're going. And then Jesus is like, okay, I guess I'm just going to keep walking. And they're like, no, why don't you stay with us? And they come inside and they start to break bread. And then their eyes are finally open to see who Jesus is. And I really think that John recognizes Jesus. The disciples recognize that it's Jesus, not just from the miracle, but I think he recognizes his sense of humor. And so don't miss that. Jesus, he meets Peter and he meets the disciples in his failure with humor. And then also here, this is not the first time that we have seen Jesus do this miracle. Ooh, this gives me chills when I was studying this. That that back in Luke 5, that when Jesus did this miracle, it was when he first called Peter. And what happens in Luke 5 is that Peter, same scenario. We've been fishing all night, and Jesus says, cast your nets into the deep. And what does Peter think? Like, I've been doing that the whole night, but okay, let me do it at your word. And then the same thing happens. He can't even haul it in because there's so many fish. And what does Peter say? He says, depart from me, Lord, I'm a sinful man. And what does Jesus say to him? He says, don't be afraid. Peter, you are a fisherman, but now you are going to be a fisher of men. Follow me. I just love the creativity, the sense of humor, the creativity to recreate the miracle from when he first called Peter, to let him know and to let you know tonight that the invitation to relationship is still open, Peter. That you are still not worthy of, you are still a sinful man, but the invitation is open. I'm meeting you with kindness. I'm recreating the miracle from when I first called you. And there's a student here in Forney and Sunnyvale and Kaufman, and wherever you are, that you feel like you have failed God. And I want you to know through this story that the invitation to relationship is still open to you. And as we move down, so what's our response to that? I love Peter's response. It says in verse 7, that the disciple whom Jesus loved, we know that's John, therefore said to Peter, "It is the Lord." And when Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he was stripped for work, and threw himself into the sea. And the other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from land, but about 100 yards off. And I just get this sense that there are students that are listening to this, that you feel so far from God. You feel no matter if you have been a skeptic and you haven't been believing in Jesus, or you don't believe in Jesus, or you're curious about this whole thing, or you have been a follower of Jesus your whole life. But if you're honest with yourself, you say, man, I feel so far from God. I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do. Is there something I'm supposed to say? Is there like a formula to this thing? And I want us to take a lesson from Peter here. As soon as he hears that it is the Lord, what does he do? He doesn't, and this is our tendency, this is sometimes my tendency, is we want to move to the back of the boat. Like, I don't want Jesus to see me. It's the Lord. No, Peter immediately jumps out of the boat. And I can just picture him swimming. We know it's about 100 yards, so he's swimming, and the disciples are like rowing next to him, like, man, he could have, that's all right, Peter, just let him swim. And he's swimming, and then he gets to a point where he can touch, and then he starts, running and stumbling. And I love the fact that, and take this lesson, don't run away from God in your failure. You run to him. And I just picture Jesus just watching him like, Peter, what are you doing? But Jesus is ready he's ready on the shore to receive Peter. And it doesn't have to look a certain way, but it does have to be honest. God wants your honesty, to come to him and agree already with it was a failure. This is what it is. Come to him in humility. And what does Jesus have on the shore there for Peter? What does he have? Is he going to scold him? Is he going to demote him to a lesser disciple? No. What does he have? He has breakfast. He has an icy. He has breakfast there waiting for Peter. And if you know anything about Jewish culture, you know that sharing a meal with somebody is one of the most intimate things that you can do with a person. And now Jesus, he's there, and in verse 9, moving down, we're on the shore now. When they got out on land, they saw a charcoal fire in place with fish laid out, and on it bread. And Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you have just caught." Well, notice that Jesus already has fish. He doesn't need anything from the disciples, but he's like, okay, we'll just use some of your fish too. And so Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore full of large fish. I can just imagine like Jesus is leaving this open to anyone who wants to go do it. And Simon Peter is like trying to make up for maybe some of the, and so he's like, yeah, sure, I'll do it. And so he runs over, and 153 of them to be exact. And although there were so many, the net was not torn. It says, Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast. Come and have an icy. Come and fellowship with me." And now none of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. And Jesus came and took the bread and gave it to them, and the fish as well. And this was now the third time that Jesus was revealed to the disciples. Now, I want you to notice a specific detail maybe that you missed. And after reading this a few times, I maybe missed it. But then going in verse 9, it says, when they got out on land, they saw a charcoal fire. Now, fire is all over Scripture, right? We know fire is everywhere from, Genesis all the way. Fire is everywhere. But a charcoal fire, that is very specific, right? And did some research. The only two places that charcoal fire is mentioned in Scripture is in the book of John. It happens twice. It's mentioned here in the context of sharing a meal with Jesus. And guess where else we find charcoal fire? It is right after Peter betrays Jesus for the first time. Guess what he is standing around to warm himself? A charcoal fire. And I believe John is very intentional with making this detail, making this point. Because oftentimes in our failure, I want you to think about the thing where you feel like you have failed God or you continue to fail God. And there is a song, there's a person, there's a place, there's a smell that actually triggers that terrible memory of that failure. And it triggers the shame and it triggers you withdrawing away from God. And I love what Jesus is doing here with Peter as he is bringing, as soon as Peter would have walked up on the shore, I'm guessing he would have saw the charcoal fire and maybe that memory would have triggered of him rejecting Jesus. And maybe it's something that just Jesus and him do. And I love that now no longer, Jesus is redeeming it. He no longer, or are you going to remember this fire in the context of betraying me? Now it's going to be something where we share a meal around this fire. And I want to have fellowship with you. So when you smell charcoal, you'll think of breakfast with me. And now where is Jesus going to go? Are we going to talk about this? Or are we just going to eat breakfast and this is going to go unaddressed? No, I've met you with kindness. I've met you with humor. I've said the invitation to relationship is open. We're eating breakfast. We're having an icy. But now it's time to address the sin. This is not going to go untalked about. And God, that's one of the things that there are some students that are going to be at the Forney campus, Sunnyvale, Kaufman, that it is time. God's met you with the open invitation relationship, but now he wants to bring you through the failure. He wants to talk about the sin. You're going to talk about it with one of the youth pastors. You're going to talk about it with the counselor. You're going to talk about it. It's gone unaddressed for too long. And what Jesus is doing is he's wanting to bring Peter through the failure. It's time to address this. Not to shame you, Peter, but actually to take the shame out. Not to bring more pain just to bring pain, but actually to relieve the pain ultimately. And I love, a knife in the hand of the wrong person cuts to wound, right? There's no other just cut, but a knife in the hand of a surgeon cuts to heal. And I think about even when I was playing basketball in middle school. I remember one of my teammates, we were scrimmaging, and one of my teammates passed the ball, and I closed my hand a little bit too early, and the ball hit right on the tip of my finger, turned it sideways, and popped it out of place. And I remember jumping around, and I think normally people scream during that. I think the only thing I could think to do was like, I couldn't even hardly breathe because it hurt so bad. And I remember my coach coming over to me, and he looked at it, and it was like one of those things where he grabbed it. My dad does the same thing. It's like, yes, this hurts. My finger's sideways. Why are you grabbing it like that? And he looked at me, he goes, this is going to hurt. And then he didn't even give me a chance to do anything. And he grabbed my finger, turned it, and it popped back into place. And that hurt even worse. But ultimately, it wasn't just to bring about pain. He had my best in mind, and he needed to take me through the pain to heal me. And that is exactly what Jesus is doing with Peter. And ultimately, I think what is happening here is Jesus is saving Peter's life from being defined by his failure. Jesus is saving Peter from just going back and fishing. I'm just going to do what's familiar, because if Peter does that, then he misses out on everything that God has called him to. And we know that a lot was accomplished through Peter in Acts and on in the New Testament, but he misses out on all of that. And Jesus, right now, we are addressing this because you are not going to be defined by this. We need to talk about it. And so he says, when they finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And I love that he uses his full name, because Jesus rarely ever uses his Peter's full name. And I think of, when your mom uses your full name and you're with your friends and you're like, hey, I got to go, boys. It's time. She means business, right? And this Jesus means business. Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And he said to him, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to him, feed my lambs. And he said to him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And he said, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. And he said to him, tend my sheep. And he said to him the third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? You think that it's a coincidence that Jesus asked Peter 3 times, do you love me? No. And he said to him the third time, or he said, do you love me? And he said to him, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. And Jesus said to him, feed my sheep. What Jesus is wanting to do with some of you tonight, he's wanting to bring you to the shore. He's wanting to show you kindness. He's wanting to have a meal with you. But he's wanting to talk about this sin issue, this thing, this failure that you've been running away from him. You've been distracting yourself, and it's time to deal with this. And, I feel like there's a lot of times where I've failed God. I've had this sense of, man, I failed him, and I've had the temptation to be defined by my failure. When I first started following Jesus, I remember a couple weeks in thinking to myself, man, I remember, and it's just lies and Satan trying to guilt me and to keep me from walking out my calling. But I remember thinking to myself, man, in middle school, high school, most of college, I have just wasted all this time that God has given me. I've influenced people in such a negative way. I feel like maybe I've even led people away from Jesus, and I've hurt people, and I feel like I need to apologize to half of Oklahoma. There is just so many things that I have done, God, and just feeling this huge weight of failure. And I remember Jesus bringing me to this scene with Peter and Jesus in John 21. And he said, Jeff, do you love me? Yes, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. All right, good. I know you love me. Now, let's not be defined by this. Let's not stay here. It's time. You are forgiven. It's over. Let's move on. And I remember something similar happened in Boulder, Colorado, when I was part of a church plant there for a year and leading college ministry. And I remember thinking like I was such a disappointment. Numbers weren't growing like I thought they were. I was doubting. A lot of discouraging things happened. I was doubting my calling and of what God was calling me to. And I remember just being alone in my apartment in Boulder, Colorado, in this same scene, God brings me back to with Peter. Do you love me, Jeff? Yes, Lord. You know that I love you. You know all things. Okay, good. I know that you love me. Now it's time. There's too many lost people. There's too many people that need to hear about me for you to stay here and just go do something random or go do something that's familiar, go to coaching, go to teaching. Just do what is familiar to you because you're afraid to address this and move forward. I'm forgiven you. Let's go. Let's go do that. And then lastly, recently, about 5-6 months ago, I was engaged, and the engagement ended and the relationship ended. And I remember just having this deep sense of failure. Like I had just failed God in so many ways. And I remember the shame and the just feeling like I had let God down. And I was in my room, I remember alone at night, and some of you maybe have experienced this type of grief, and I picture this is what Peter experienced when he had denied Jesus and he went out, and the heartache that he had wept bitterly, and it's the best way I can describe it is it feels like you are drowning on the inside, and there's no relief, there's no walk it out, talk it out, believe me, I tried, there's no worship it out, pray it out, it just sits with you, and I'm just praying to God and just seeking relief and trying to be delivered from this, Lord. And I remember God recreating this miracle. And he just brings me back to this scene in John 21. And I remember him saying, Jeff, do you love me? Yes, Lord. You know that I love you. Yeah, I know you love me. I refuse to allow you to be defined by this. Now it's time. We've dealt with it. It's time to move on. It's time to move on. And I will know, and someone needs to hear this tonight, no matter what it is that you've done. No matter how far you think you are from God, he is seeking after you. And I determined on that night that I would not allow my life to be dictated by my failure, but I would allow it to be dictated by my faith. Faith in who? Faith in a person, not just faith in faith, but faith in Jesus and everything that he has done for me. And then one of the things that failure does is Jesus brings you to the foot of the cross, and you're like, man, I think I'm the only one here that's dealing with this. I think I'm the only one who's dealt with failure. And I look around and I see my mom and I see my dad and I see my first hour teacher and I see Pastor Jeremy and I see Tyler, and it's like, well, shoot, everyone's here. And that's what the Bible teaches us, is that every single person has failed God. But praise be to God for sending his Son into the world, the righteous one for the righteous man. Jesus gave his life for Peter, and he gave his life for you, so that anyone who believes in him does not have to be defined by your failure, but is defined by the one who created all things, who overcame sin and overcame death, and he is saving Peter's life. And someone here feels like, man, you feel like a victim. You've been playing this scene over and over again in your head of the ways you failed God, and for too long you have allowed yourself to not walk with God, and it is time that Jesus brings you to the shore and you let him define who you are. And I love to hear in verse 18, you remember, back to the story of Peter, you remember that Peter said to the Lord, Lord, I will follow you unto death, right? And then Peter, and the very thing that he said that he would do, Jesus said, no, you won't do. But what does Jesus say in verse 18 to Peter? He says, truly, truly, another way to say this is a for sure thing. I say to you, when you were young, you used to dress yourself and walk wherever you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and another will dress you and carry you where you do not want to go. This he said to show what kind of death he was to glorify God. And after saying this, he said to me, and I just picture him saying with this, with just the warmest smile, Peter, I love it, follow me. And the very thing that Peter said that he would not do before his failure, Jesus said you won't do. And now he says, no, the thing that you said that you would do, now you will do. And because when Peter said that he would go to death even for Jesus, the faith was shallow. The commitment was shallow. It wasn't deep. But now this is one of the things that you don't want to miss about failure, that as Jesus brings you through the failure, that your commitment deepens, that he brings you to a deeper place of commitment, a deeper place of worship, a deeper place of affection for him, a deeper place of appreciation for the grace of God over your life. And now, Peter, now your commitment, you will follow me unto death. You will do that very thing that, and this is how you are going to glorify God. And some of you tonight, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The Lord has brought you through it, and maybe you're in the middle of it. I want you to know that as Jesus walks you through this wound, as he walks you through this failure, that it is so worth it for your faith to deepen, your love to deepen for God. Peter saw that, and one of the things that we see here is that Peter stands up on the day of Pentecost, and I love this. And who better, if Peter would not have taken Jesus at his word that, hey, you're forgiven, I love you, let's move forward. But he takes him at his word, right? And at Pentecost, he stands up, and who better to preach about the grace of God than somebody who had received such incredible grace from Jesus, from God. And that he says that he stands up and preaches at Pentecost, and how many people come to know Christ and Peter misses out on that if he just stays a fisherman, if he allows his life to be defined by his failure, to be defined by his shame, but Jesus saved him from that. And if we could have been there to see the joy on Peter's, 3,000 people coming to know Christ, 3,000 people, their eternity changed, and God has something special in store for you, but will you take him at his word and follow him? And I was praying about, thinking about how do we close? There's a lot of different ways we can go with this message and ending it, and I thought about Mark 16. At the end of Mark 16, it says that it says that the angel came to the tomb and tells Mary, hey, Jesus is risen, and go tell the disciples and who? And Peter, that Jesus is risen and that he will meet you. He will meet you in Galilee. Go ahead to you to Galilee. And I love this picture of how Jesus is going to meet, hey, tell Peter that I'm going to meet him here. And I don't think Peter would have came otherwise had Jesus not mentioned his name. And I want somebody in Forney, somebody in Sunnyvale, somebody in Kaufman, somebody in Rockwall to know that if Jesus wasn't finished with Peter, that he is not finished with you, and that he said it is finished. And notice what Jesus didn't say. He didn't say that I'm finished, because we know that Jesus was actually just getting started. And so I want somebody in Forney, in Sunnyvale, in Kaufman, in Rockwall, whoever's listening, that God is not finished with you yet. You need to believe that. You need to take Jesus at his word, or you will live a life defined by your failure. And Jesus wants to save you from that. He wants to meet you. So what does Jesus think of you when you have failed? He wants to meet you with humor. He wants to meet you with kindness. He wants to meet you with love. He wants to invite you to an icy. He wants to invite you to eat breakfast with him. And then he wants to address the sin, forgive you, and send you out to tell people about him. There is no one like him. And I hope that you're getting a more crystal clear picture of how amazing Jesus is. God's not done with you yet. He's not done with you. If he wasn't done with Peter, he's not done with you. It's not finished. It's not your story is not. You got to stay in it. You got to stay in it. You got to stay through the pain. You got to stay through the disappointment. You got to stay through the hurt, because God is not finished with you yet, and he wants to use you. Don't miss out on all that God has for you, because you live a life defined by your shame, but defined by your failure. Let me pray for us. Father, thank you, God, for everything that you do for us, for how wonderful you are. And I pray that you open some students' eyes tonight. You open their eyes to help them see who Jesus is. See more clearly of how deeply he loves people, that he loved us so much that he died for our sins and rose from the dead. And what kind of God is this, that he would also eat breakfast with his people? Your love is who you are. I just pray that students see that. I pray that students don't allow their failures to define them, God, that you would set some people free tonight. You would lift some discouraged heads, God, and that the seeds that were sown tonight would be sown on good soil, Lord, and good hearts, and you would bring fruit from this message, God. And I'm just praying, Lord, that you watch over your students, your people in Forney and Kaufman and Sunnyvale and Rockwall, Lord, and you use these students. You raise up laborers, and you use these students for your glory and for your name. In the mighty name of Jesus, I pray. Amen. We're going to turn it over to your campus leadership.